Hello everybody and welcome to Pepakura, the Art of Papercraft. Thank you for stopping by. And today I'm going to talk about how I build papercraft, like my Vmon here and many others that I've built throughout the years. Now before we begin, if you haven't yet done so, stop over at my site, rakogaspapercraft.wordpress.com/panel documents. If you go to this page, you can download some sample patterns that you can use to follow along. If you'd like to try building one yourself during the presentation, though keep in mind that with this presentation being only a half hour, you won't have nearly enough time to finish one, though I would be more than happy to provide additional tips and supports if you reach out to me on social media later. And with that, let's get started. First, to introduce myself, I typically go by White Rakogas or Rakogas Papercraft on the internet. I've been building papercraft for about 8 years now, during which time I've built about 200 models. I'm also a papercraft designer, which means in addition to building patterns that I find on the internet, I design my own patterns too. I run a little YouTube video series on the subject, Rakogas' Paper Tips. Outside of papercraft, I'm a writer of fiction, a cosplayer mostly of creature characters. And before anyone asks, yes, I am very much insane. So first, to clarify, when I tell people I do papercraft, the first thing a lot of them think is origami, which is an art of just folding paper, completely different art form. Kirigami is folding and cutting, which is also completely different art form. And some people also think of cubicraft or paper toys, which are low detail, simpler models like this one right here. You got a block for the head, torso, arms, and legs. It's an interesting concept because with just a different coat of paint, basically, you can do pretty much any character you want in this format. But it's not very detailed, and I find that low detail to be a bit of a drag, which is why I'm interested in high detail papercraft or Pepakura. So what exactly is this art form? In a nutshell, it's the art of assembling a model by cutting and pasting pieces of paper, like how I built Vmon. These start off as 3D models from the computer. Some of them are models from video games. Other times they're models that are designed by enthusiasts. It's a fun and low-cost way you can build a nice collection of your favorite characters. And some people have adapted it as a way of making cosplay props and accessories. As an example, my Aron mask here, the base was made out of papercraft. I then reinforced it with a layer of fiberglass resin and painted for color. I also have the back shell right here, same technique. But I've seen people go pretty wild with this technique, I have seen people build full wearable set of Iron Man armor. So yeah, I have a separate cosplay page where I've got more pics of my Aron armor. So yeah, paper is really quite amazing, isn't it? Now, one of the things that helped bring me to this art form is the simple fact that you pretty much have what you need to get started around the house already. I mean, you would need a pattern for the model. These are often PDO files that you can download from the internet, though sometimes they're just PDFs. There's hundreds, thousands of free patterns that you can find out there on the internet, or you can design your own, and there are some people who sell their patterns. If you've got a PDO file, in order to read that, you'd need a piece of software, Pepakura Viewer. These days, Pepakura Viewer comes bundled with Designer. Viewer is totally free. Designer you would have to pay to unlock some features of, but you probably aren't going to be needing those features if you're just getting started. It is Windows only, If you're a Mac user, you could probably get it running through Wineskin. You need paper, well, obviously, scissors for cutting the paper, and glue. Plain old Elmer's glue all works just fine, but I would steer clear of using any washable glues or glue sticks, as these will not hold model well together over time. Yeah, some people, though, prefer to use some sort of specialty craft glue, which may work even better. So, you'd need a decent color printer for printing out the pattern, or if you just have a black and white printer, you can use that and paint the finished model later. And finally, you need time, because these are not quick to make. I mean, I can make a simple one in a single evening, but most models take days or even weeks to build. Mind you, when I say that, keep in mind I do have a full-time day job. If you did have the time and the patience to build one model straight through, beginning to end, you could probably finish most models within a single day. And with that, let's get into building, how we go from the pattern to the finished model. So you can see right here, I've got a picture of the VMon pattern when I initially printed it out. And here's a picture of VMon in Pepakura Viewer. And right here, I've got a sample pattern of the Amara model, which is one of the ones that I included in that download package. If you'd like to build a model from home, you should take out your pattern. On the sample patterns I provided on the website link, I have a point where the starting point is marked. So if you start from there, now I personally do recommend using Pepakura Viewer if you can, but because I know some people might not want to install it just yet, I've also included a second copy of the pattern that has edge IDs. You naturally don't want to build that version, but on each of the tabs there's a number, and on each of the edges there's a number. You want to glue each tab under the edge of the piece that has the same number, and that will give you all the instructions you need. As far as Pepakura Viewer goes, here's a copy of that same Amara pattern in Pepakura Viewer. As you can see, a 3D image showing the finished model on the left, and the actual pattern on the right. If I was to click any piece of the pattern, it will highlight it in the model. If I mouse over one of the tabs, it will point to the surface that the tab goes under. It really provides all the instructions you need, very easy to use. I personally find it indispensable. Now, if you were to look at one of my sample patterns that I've already printed out, you would notice that it is printed on slightly thicker paper than normal printer paper. If you look up any Papercraft tutorial online, they're going to give you this stock advice. Do not use ordinary printer paper. Only use cardstock. My response to that, they're full of it. It is true that if you're using thicker paper, you're going to get a more durable model. It's less likely to fold or crinkle in ways you don't want it to, but cardstock is very difficult to work with. It's a lot more difficult to get cardstock to stay in the right position while the glue dries. If you're dealing with really tiny pieces, cardstock can be nearly impossible to work with. And despite what they say, ordinary printer paper can work just fine, especially if you're building smaller models. I personally started with ordinary printer paper for my first dozen or so models before I decided to invest in something a little thicker. I personally don't recommend it, but it can work. My personal recommendation is something in between. I believe the best paper weight is somewhere between 28 to 32 pounds, which is 105 to 120 GSM. But in the end, it really comes down to personal preference. There is no wrong choice so long as you can work with it and you like the results. Now, when it comes to building, order is very important. You're going to want to start with a piece that has a lot of tabs and close with a small piece that doesn't. So here, for starting Vemon, I'm cutting around the piece on top of his head, which, as you can see there, has tabs that go all the way around. The basic rule, you build in the direction that the tabs point. Follow the instructions. I mean, not just paying attention to Pepakura Viewer or your Edge IDs, but if you download a pattern off the internet, you do get some tips on the best way to build it. I'd suggest following them because they are very helpful. Yeah, I find most models are designed so that you start from the head or the topmost or the frontmost section of the model. Though it's not a hard and fast rule, there are plenty of exceptions. I've designed some exceptions. But take note of this. If you find that you are trying to force the pieces, if the tabs don't seem to line up quite right with the surface on the next piece, you are probably building them in the wrong order. Another thing you might have noticed on those patterns is that there are no folding lines. In general, when you download a pattern off the internet, you get two versions of it. What we call the lineless version and the lined version. And you would notice the lined version does have folding lines in it. If you were to look really close here, you would actually see two types of dashed lines. One that represents mountain folds and another that represents valley folds. Now you would think the lined version of the pattern is easier to work with, but folding everywhere can be quite tedious, and most of those folds aren't really necessary. Instead of folding everywhere, if you just bend the paper around, rely on the natural folds of the paper, you'll get a much cleaner, smoother, better looking model in the end, and it's a lot less tedious to do. You do almost always want to fold the tabs though. Now, if you're building a model that has a lot more angles to it, like a building or a robot of some sort, in that case, you might need to make more folds, and the lined version might be a little more useful there. But personally, my opinion is that the lineless version of the model is only slightly more difficult, and yet it looks significantly better in the end. I've been building lineless models from the day I started without problem. I think I've only done lined models once or twice when there wasn't a lineless version available. And with that, let's get into the actual assembly of pieces. So here you can see I'm building the first piece around Vemon's head. Most models are, at their core, a series of rings of different sizes and shapes that determine the size and the shape of the model. Here I'm attaching Vemon's ears. I built them separately, and then once they were finished, I glued them to the main section of the model. Same idea in the horn on his nose, but as that's a much smaller piece, I just glue that flat against the main section of the model. His mouth, that's the same idea, but it's done inward rather than outward like the ears are, which is actually quite a bit more difficult. Now we keep going. Teeth are a pain because they are really tiny. It is very difficult to get them to stay in just the position you want, and if you drop one of them on the carpet, it is probably gone for good. Here you can see I'm using the tweezers to help me get that tooth position just right. And once again, I'm using the tweezers to attach the neck to the head because sometimes the glue likes sticking to your fingers better than it does the paper. Here you can see I'm working on building one of his arms and his hands. And there is the finished arm attached to the model. Now I move on to the other arm and oops. As you can see here, my first attempt to build the other arm did not exactly go smoothly. But then, everybody makes mistakes. I mean, we're only human. Well, most of us here at least. But remember, this isn't like a plastic model that you get at your local hobby store. If you accidentally destroy a piece, you can always just go and reprint a replacement piece. If you accidentally cut off or destroy some tabs, you can just glue a little scrap paper in place to make a replacement tab. If there's some visible damage on one of the pieces, you can very easily hide that by gluing an identical piece over top, preferably with slightly thinner paper. But I've been doing this for 8 years now. I have never once had to scrap a half-finished model because I made a mistake. You don't give up. You would really have to fail pretty epically if you do have to do that. But yeah, with a little persistence, you can get through even the toughest sections. On my second attempt, I was able to attach the arm just fine. And once both arms were attached, I continued building down his body. The ridges on his back, same idea as the horn on his nose, glued flat against the main section of the model. Here I've started working on his tail, which I'm building out from the main section of the model. And there is the finished tail. We're almost done. Moving on to the legs. Once again, I'm just building these off the main section of the model. Okay, closing models can be quite difficult because there's generally not a lot of room. You can apply pressure from the inside. Here you can see I've got a closing piece that has no tabs on it. If it had 1 or 2 tabs, first thing I would do would be to use that tab, glue that inside the model. Once that glue is dried, it'll function as a hinge that'll make it easier to get the rest. Since there are no tabs on this one, I just glue one of them in first, off the body. Same idea. If there's a lot of tabs on the piece you're trying to close with, you're probably built the pieces in the wrong order, but you can easily fix that by just making some replacement tabs. Now here I'm continuing building down the legs, attaching his toes. One leg done, moving on to the other one. And with that, he's done. So I take a moment to admire my accomplishment. Then I go online and decide which one to build next. And once I've got a few, I take them outside to get some pictures for my gallery. Next question. Does he stand on his own? No. It is true that many models will stand just fine on their own, but other times there's one section of the model that's a little top-heavy or back-heavy, and you have to add some sort of a counterweight to that model before you close it in order for it to stand on its own. So you can use anything that's got a little weight to it, like a coin, a paper clip, small rock, or a stone. Myself, I'm something of a purist, so I use scrap paper. And yeah, I did add some scrap paper to Veemon's belly in order to try and counterbalance the weight of the tail. Unfortunately, it was a little too late. Oh well, live and learn. Or there are some models where the feet are just too tiny and no matter how much weight you add, you will never be able to get them to stand. In those cases, you can only glue it to a base of some sort. Now, Papercraft models do look great, but you do have to remember that they are only paper, and paper will deteriorate over time. Plus, if you're not careful, one of them can be smashed. Now, like I said earlier, if you're using thicker paper, that will hold up better over time, but I started out using ordinary printer paper for my first dozen or so models, and despite being 8 years old now, they're still in pretty good condition. To show this, here's Shaman, one of my very first models, built about 8 years ago. He done with normal printer paper. Still holds up just fine. Very good shape. So there are things you can do to help preserve the models even if you are using ordinary printer paper, like reinforcing sensitive areas. When I talk about reinforcing models, I always use my Lugia as an example here. You see, Lugia's wings stretch rather far from the main body. As such, over time, the wings will eventually sag if I don't do anything to reinforce them, which I did by attaching an extra tube of paper in the shoulder area. And if you were to actually physically feel this model, you would feel that the model is noticeably thicker in that area. Additionally, there's the legs, which you can see are built at quite an angle. As such, they do have the potential to collapse under the weight of the top of the model. So once again, I stuck in an extra tube of paper inside the legs to make them stronger. Now, most models won't need you to do stuff like this, but it also helps to store the models in a sealed area. There's an old picture of one of my display cabinets. And then there's varnish. If you use it correctly, varnish will work wonders for preserving models. If you don't, it will destroy them. So you want to make sure you test your varnish before you apply it to your most valuable creations. So start with a small, simpler model that you don't mind losing. In my case, I just built pyramids for that. Now, if you use it carefully, Krylon Clear Spray Matte Finish works. That's what I use. But you do want to be careful, pay attention to the labels on it. Don't spray too close to the model. And never, ever, 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 ever try to varnish a model in humid weather. If it's humid, the humidity will get captured under the varnish, which will cause the model to get discolored by it. And that is a royal pain in the neck to fix. Now, like I said previously, you've pretty much got everything you need to get started around the house already, but if you end up more like me, there are other tools you can use that'll make your life easier. For example, you saw me using tweezers during some of the VMON example pics to help apply pressure. A needle or a pin can also be helpful for applying pressure if you need to get into even tighter areas. Straight edge for straighter folds. An X-Acto knife. Some people say you should just use an X-Acto knife for cutting out the pieces rather than scissors. I personally think an X-Acto knife can be quite helpful at times. It's more precise than scissors, but generally less accurate, so I don't think it can replace them entirely. Pencils, sometimes it's helpful to mark a tab. Super glue, sometimes there's a piece that's going to have to be glued at a very extreme angle, and if you use super glue rather than normal glue, you don't have to hold it in position for 2 episodes of your favorite anime while the glue dries. And there's varnish, like I previously mentioned. Now, if you want to get into papercraft design, you would need 3D editing software like Blender, which is free but notoriously difficult to learn, or Metasequoia, which I believe has a free version. And that's when you would need to purchase the full Pepakura designer, which last I checked costs about $40 for a license. And with that, I'm going to talk about design. Design is a very advanced topic, so I'm really only going to be scratching the surface here today. There are papercraft builders with way more experience than me who've never bothered going into design. But eventually, if you've been building long enough, there's going to be some character you just have to add to your collection, but you can't find a pattern of them anywhere on the internet. And in that case, you need to get into design. Now, I've been around the internet a while. I've seen lots of really good designs out there, and I've seen some others. I find that there are really 2 main rules that separate them. First, do not attempt to design a model until you've built some first. Now, when you build models, you start to learn that there's more than one way any section can be unfolded. Some ways are easy to build, some are more difficult, some are just plain frustrating, and that's which ways are which is really something that can only be learned from experience. And you never just take a random 3D model that you find on the internet, throw it into Pepakura Designer, hit the unfold button, and think you've got something you can build. You have to edit it first. So here, that's the original VMon model I started with in Blender, ready for some editing. Why do you need to edit it? Well, look at the detail of the model. This model was originally designed for a video game, not an arts and crafts project. As such, a lot of those extra polygons are going to add more pieces to the model than there needs to be, making it a lot more difficult to build. And sometimes there are pieces that are embedded inside other pieces in a way that physically can't happen in the real world. And this will all need to be corrected. You're also going to want to pose the model because the standard T-pose just don't really look good. And then once you've got something you think you're ready to unfold, you send it over to Pepakura Designer. You mark where you want to separate some of the pieces. And then once you think you've got something you can build, hit the unfold button. Right there, that was my first attempt to unfold VMon. You have some pieces that are so maddeningly complicated that no normal human could ever expect to build them, and pieces that are way too simple and should probably just be combined with another piece to avoid wasting time when you're building it. I personally find you need to go back and forth between 3D editing and Pepakura Designer at least a few times before you've got a model ready to build. And you're also going to need to adjust the tabs. They don't exactly start in the best places by default. And then, once you think you've got something ready to build, build it. If you're planning on sharing your designs online, you should always build it first, or find somebody who'd be willing to test build it for you. During that initial build, watch for difficult sections and tweak them appropriately. Like after my initial build of VMon, I decided that it would be better to have those tabs on the other side in the mouth area. So I adjusted that for future builds. Now here's a list of some of my favorite websites where you can find and download Papercraft models. And of course me, I'm a designer too. If you haven't yet, you can certainly see a lot of my models I've released for public download at rakogaspapercraft.wordpress.com. You can also check out my gallery of all my finished models on DeviantArt or Facebook, or reach out to me on Twitter. Also, look up Rakogas' Paper Tips on YouTube. I'm afraid we aren't really going to have a lot of time for questions today, so if anybody does have any questions or needs some additional support on one of their models, feel free to reach out to me on Facebook or Twitter, and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. Now, to really show you what you can do with Papercraft, this model right here is my Zuchaomon. This is probably the most difficult model I ever built, and I did design this one myself. 239 pieces, and well, took me like half a year to design the pattern and build him. He is available on my website, but not recommended for beginners. And you can also build human characters, though they are quite difficult to do. But if you were to look really closely there, those fingers are individual. She's also available on my website for anyone insane enough to try it. Though I definitely recommend getting a little experience before attempting those two. But I figured might as well show you what you really can do with Papercraft. Anyway, thanks for watching. Bye.